Welcome back, everyone, to the Athletic Director U podcast. This is your host, Matt Brown of Extra Points, which you can find at extrapointsmb.com. Joined again here with Jeff Nelson of Navigate to talk about the latest batch here of the college football playoff ranking probabilities. It looks like over the last week, we now have a lot more clarity, I think, about what we should actually be expecting here over the last week or two. The funny thing about college football is that the more you play it, eventually teams tend to lose and tend to sort things out here a little bit. If I'm understanding the metrics correctly, I think the last time we talked, there was a potential of maybe up to 10 teams that still had a mathematical chance, but really the list was a little bit smaller. Looking at things now, meaningfully, we're down to 6, 7, or 8, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we're down to 8. And the beauty of it is that a few of these play each other here coming up. And so that is very quickly going to dwindle based on some results.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the results then from last week, obviously the team that dropped down the most significantly was Oregon, who by your model had their playoff chances drop a whopping 51.3%. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but looking at the spreadsheet, it looks like their current odds are now 0.
Which is correct.
Yeah, it would be hard to argue against that, I think, from watching not just the fact that they lost, but how they lost and the totality of how they lost, so that they still have a chance here at the Rose Bowl. We also saw Wake Forest lose, which I think summarily dismisses the ACC. And we saw Michigan State lose by roughly a gajillion points.
Yep.
So now looking here at the top 4, we now have 4 teams with an above a 50% chance by the model. We have Georgia at 91, Cincinnati at 72, Ohio State at 58, and Alabama at 55. So before we get into some of the other teams looking in here that are going to have the opportunity to play themselves in, we've talked before about one of the challenges of this system is juxtaposing what you see on the spreadsheet and what you know is informed by recent history and by precedent versus what you see here with your own eyes. Is there anything in your opinion that what you see with your eyes diverges from what you see here on the spreadsheet in terms of what's most likely to happen?
Less and less, that's the case. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we were worried about Cincinnati for a long time, that Cincinnati in the model was going to continue to look like a probable CFP team, when in reality, if there were numerous Power 5 teams that could make a viable claim, it was going to be harder for Cincinnati to actually get in, at least based on what Gary Barta and the committee has told us. But like you said at the outset, with each week, there's at least one team that seems to lose and drop itself out of contention. And I think more and more, I feel better about Cincinnati looking so good in the model.
I think I'm with you. And it wasn't just that a bunch of other teams lost ahead of them, but we've talked before about how you need some of the other games that aren't necessarily involving a top 10 team to maybe break your way. And just over the past week, I believe the Bearcats will get a chance here to finish the season against ECU, who's going to finish with a winning record, somewhat improbably. They're currently at 7-4. My understanding is that the committee does add an additional proverbial check mark to beating teams with winning records or bowl bids. And then they're going to have a championship game opponent in Houston, who's sitting at a very impressive 10-1 and should be in the college football playoff top 25 heading into that game. Does that runs with what you're seeing too?
Yeah, that's exactly right. They really, once SMU lost and then lost twice in a row, those heartbreakers, Cincinnati needed Houston to do what it's been doing, which is provide a viable title game that Cincinnati can go and win and kind of further bolster its case as another good win. And I think if it really gets into the nitty gritty and the committee is looking at, okay, well, Cincinnati beat Houston. Well, how good was Houston? And Houston's only loss going into that game was to Texas Tech. And if you go back and look at that game, if I remember right, Houston was actually leading at halftime, and then just kind of a series of unfortunate events in the second half turned it in Texas Tech's favor. But
Yeah.
those are the kinds of things where, again, if you're really trying to parse out the argument for who should get that last CFP spot, I think Cincinnati is in a better position with Houston being a strong team, like you said.
You are right on that. This feels like this was the first game of the season, which feels like 6 years ago, because the internet has completely ruined our sense of time. But I actually have this pulled up. Midway through the third quarter, ESPN gave Houston an 86% chance of winning the game. Then they go on and give up, like 25, 26 unanswered points. The wheels kind of fell off. Clearly, those teams aren't the same team that they are right now.
Yeah.
And that's one of the other challenges of this entire system, is because teams, by their performance, whether that's due to injury or improvement or coaching attrition or many of these other factors, they're not static entities. Right. They improve, they decline over the course of the season, which leads us to what I think might be the nightmare scenario, not just for the credibility of the college football playoff institution, but for sports radio stations across the country. I want to talk about Notre Dame, a team that also right now is playing much better, much more complete football than they were at the beginning of the year, when they were lucky, let's be honest, to get through the beginning of the season with just one loss. They have, by your model, have just a 21% chance of making the playoff, but they're almost certainly going to finish the season with just the one loss. They increased by almost 7% here from last week. And there's not that many compelling one-loss teams left in this potential field. Is there a way where Notre Dame makes this field and Cincinnati doesn't?
Yeah, that's a good question. Our model doesn't think that's Notre Dame's path in. The model gives Notre Dame that chance on the potential scenario that, let's say Georgia is in and Cincinnati is in, but Georgia beats Bama again in the SEC title game. So now Bama has 2 losses. And then let's say that either in the Big Ten with Ohio State and Michigan, or in the Big 12, especially with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, if the way the rest of the season unfolds is such that only one of those 4 teams I just mentioned, Ohio State, Michigan, only one, let's say one of those wins out from here, but in the other, they beat each other up a little in the final week and then the conference championship game. That in our model is Notre Dame's path in, that Bama gets knocked down and that Ohio State, Michigan, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma only produces basically one viable team.
So that's very interesting. That would certainly make an interesting semifinal game, a rematch between Cincinnati and Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And now I think the Bearcats could pretty easily claim they have the best out of conference victory out of anybody in the field right now. I want to talk about Alabama here for a second, because your model still gives them a 55% chance of making the field. And this is not something I think we're used to doing in college football, to say like Alabama's going to head into that SEC championship game as a decided underdog, not like a 12-point underdog, but I think a lot of bookmakers and fans will expect Georgia to win that game. Does Alabama have a path forward here if they lose to Georgia? Is there a chance for them to make the playoff as a 2-loss team without an especially compelling win?
Yeah, they have a slight chance. That's why we're at 55% in our model, because our model does not give them a 55% chance to win that game against Georgia, although it does think it's a close game.
Yeah.
But if Alabama loses, but again, there's kind of carnage below them. So if Ohio State, Michigan, Oklahoma State, if in those 2 conferences, whatever the outcome of this weekend's game, if the winners then go out and lose in their conference championship games, or just as a reminder, our model does account for margin of defeat. So if anybody not only loses, but gets blown out, and Bama keeps it close with Georgia, but loses, there is a path there. It's very slight, less than a 10% chance, but there's a path.
There's a path. Well, honestly, less than a 10% chance is. I mean, like when we're looking at this field in general, if it's 8%, I mean, hey, that's still better than Baylor.
Yeah.
That's not an enormous difference from even where Notre Dame is right now. So it's not crazy.
Yeah.
If I'm looking at the model here correctly, am I to infer that your system believes it is more likely that Oklahoma State beats Oklahoma twice, which is borderline crazy historically, given how dominant Oklahoma's been in that rivalry? Am I reading this incorrectly?
So Oklahoma State is a slight favorite in our model over Oklahoma. The real reason their chance of getting in is higher is that in our model, Oklahoma could win twice and maybe still miss out. Whereas Oklahoma State, if it wins twice, is more likely to get in than Oklahoma. And that's just based on where they've been going in the last few weeks. And that, not to go off on a tangent too far here, but I think it's relevant to some of the other questions you've asked. You mentioned, teams now aren't who they were at the beginning of the season, like Notre Dame. And I think one of the biggest learnings from our model over the years is that there are kind of two ways. Let's use two analogies here when you think about how the CFP committee evaluates who gets in. You could think of a college football season like a painting, and every week is one part of the painting, and at the end of it, we evaluate the full painting. Is this a great painting? We evaluate the full body of work. Or it could be more like a step ladder, and everybody starts at different places on the ladder, and each week you're winning and you're moving up, and depending on how good your opposition was, how far you move up the ladder, and you lose and you drop off. And so over the course of the year, if maybe you do have an early loss and it knocks you down, but then you have 10 weeks to go up and up and up the ladder, right? That's more beneficial than the painting analogy where, we screwed up a part of the painting, and now when we evaluate the overall painting, there's that problem there. The committee clearly evaluates teams like it's a ladder, not like it's a painting. And so if you have an early loss, it does not hurt you as much. If you are hot at the end, whether it's recency bias or whether it is their intent to say who are the four best teams right now to put in a playoff, that is how they react and how they judge teams. And so back to Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, that is why in our model, if Oklahoma wins twice, their chance of getting in is still not as good as Oklahoma State's, because Oklahoma lost more recently. And our model is telling us in the minds of the committee, Oklahoma still has that kind of tarnish on them.
This is so fascinating. As I really actually get into the weeds here, it was occurring to me as we're talking about this that I think I've only watched like 2 Oklahoma State games this entire year, and that was a team that didn't really come into the season with a lot of high expectations. They played not very poorly, really. The first month and a half of the season, we're fortunate to beat a bad Tulsa team. We're fortunate to beat Boise State. Struggled around with Missouri State, but presents the second best scoring defense in all of college football. They've given up more than 23 points in a game literally once this entire season. And I think if you did everything that Oklahoma State did and maybe had a different helmet or assigned them different expectations ahead of time, not saying that the committee would have looked at it this way, but the way that that Oklahoma State would have been perceived, I think, in the national zeitgeist would be different. Whereas Oklahoma came in as like a preseason number 1 or a number 2 team. And I have to mention this informs part of what happens with the committee, just because I watch television. We've been hearing nothing but 3 months about how Oklahoma sucks, just because they're not what we thought that they were going to be. They're still objectively a very good football team. I probably can't really easily measure this, but I would be curious as to what level that kind of narrative building actually shapes how an administrator looks at this, because college football is not like college basketball where we have a net rating or some commonly agreed upon metric to remove some of that bias, right?
Yeah, we try to calibrate the model to reflect how the committee has reacted, and how the committee reacts in theory should be tied to some of those biases, some of the narratives, some of the expectation building, as you said. So I'd like to think that, deep in the ELO formula, somehow that is taken into account. And I feel better when I see that Oklahoma State has a higher chance than Oklahoma right now for the exact reasons you're saying. It's what the model tells us. And intuitively, based on the national narrative and based on where the committee's been ranking folks and based on what they've been saying, it seems right. But we'll see. I mean, I always kind of throw the asterisk out there that there's going to be a year where the model is wrong, and then we'll calibrate it. We'll try to diagnose why and learn and calibrate it, based on what we learn. Right. But it just seems every year that in October, we're like, oh man, it's so crazy. There's so many teams in the hunt. This could be a crazy finish. And then teams drop off. And so I think Oklahoma State now is in that position where it controls its own destiny to a certain extent, so long as, well, I guess it doesn't control its own destiny. Let me correct that. But I think where it finishes in relation to Oklahoma, clearly it does. And then we're going to have a really interesting learning potentially about how the committee ultimately ranks them at the very end, when they're going to have a resume that probably doesn't jump off the page.
That last point there, I think might be a good place for us to wrap up. And I recognize that we have to hedge all of this, right? Because we're not on the committee. We can't say this for certain. But if I'm looking at the sheet right now and I'm trying to come up with a list of who realistically controls their own destiny, if Georgia wins out and they are 35-point favorites against a terrible Georgia Tech team, they're certainly in the playoff. If they beat Georgia Tech, they're almost certainly in the playoff no matter what. So I think we could pretty comfortably say they control their own destiny. It looks like the model here is pretty bullish. And I think I personally have come around to this idea too. If Cincinnati wins out, they're going to get another top 25 win probably and another bowl eligible win. They're going to be undefeated. I'm guessing you would say they probably control their own destiny. If Ohio State wins out, I think we probably feel pretty comfortable that they're going to make the playoff if they beat a top 6 Michigan team and then presumably a top 15, top 20 Wisconsin team.
Or Michigan. Ohio State or Michigan. Either
true.
One of them control their own destiny.
Okay. So
if Michigan wins out, they're 100% of the time in our model.
Sure. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody who would disagree with that. I'm not missing anybody, right? I guess if Alabama wins out, then they would be too. And then everybody else needs help.
Yeah, that's right. So Oklahoma State need a little help. Notre Dame needs help. And that's right. Those 3 need a little help. The other 5, in effect, control their own destiny. And after this week, obviously Michigan or Ohio State will drop out of that. And the SEC title game is going to be, I think we will know when we're talking next week. The SEC title game will be interesting where it might not matter.
It might not.
If there's, we'll see what the model tells us about Alabama's chances if it loses. But I think depending on where the model puts Alabama in relation to the winner of Oklahoma State this next week will be very interesting.
As I'm looking at the rest of the schedule, and obviously like the biggest games here are Bedlam, Iron Bowl, the game, right? I'm having a hard time trying to find any other game that is going to be even a little bit potentially meaningful. I mean, like it sounds funny to say this, but I guess if UConn can upset Houston, that might marginally ding Cincinnati. But everything else, this is really about pride and spite rather than impacting the postseason, right?
That's right. You're exactly right.
Great.
A few must-watch games for all of us this week, but we don't have to cast our eye much wider.
Well, pride and spite are still perfectly very good reasons to be invested in college athletics. Jeff, thanks so much for this. This is really helpful. Enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday. We'll be in touch again next week, and hopefully we have a little bit more clarity.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
As we're wrapping up here, I feel like it's worth mentioning just a little bit about how weirdly asymmetrical a lot of these major rivalry games are at the end of this season, that are really going to go a long way towards shaping what the college football playoff looks like this year. We spent a lot of time in that last conversation talking about Bedlam, and I've made the same terrible joke a couple of different times about how anything's possible in Bedlam except Oklahoma State winning. And the reason for that is because looking at Winsipedia right now, the Sooners are on a 6-game win streak. They've played this series over 100 times, and Oklahoma has a 90, 18, and 7 advantage in this series. Dating back here to 2003, Oklahoma State has won just twice. Sometimes the games are extremely close, like they were in 2018, 2017, 2012. But generally, Oklahoma wins pretty comfortably. So this is going to be an unusual situation here where I think potentially the Sooners are going to be favored. The Cowboys may be favored. And the idea of one team winning this both times feels a little unusual. The game, the Ohio State-Michigan game, technically Michigan still has a 58-51-6 all-time advantage in this series. A major reason for that is because, of course, Michigan was, along with the University of Chicago, one of the two best teams outside of New England in college football's Paleolithic era. They ran up a lot of victories in Ohio State when the Buckeyes were struggling with Oberlin, Kenyon, and Denison. But the recent history of this rivalry has been all Buckeyes. Since 2004, Michigan has won this game once. Ohio State is on an 8-game win streak. Will open up this series around a touchdown or so favorite. The other big game, which is normally a much bigger game, I think, at this point here in the year, is, of course, the Iron Bowl. Auburn and Alabama. That's going to have a role to shape here what the SEC championship game looks like, what happens here with the potential 2-loss Alabama team. The Crimson Tide has a 47-37-1 all-time record in that game. And even though they're only on a 1-game win streak, Auburn has won this a couple of times recently. It has always been close, and when they have won, it has been based on something absolutely ridiculous. We had the kick 6. We had last year's, phantom special teams call penalties that changed things. Basically, in the last 15 years or so, Auburn has only won 3 times. The game's been played every year. Generally, either Alabama wins by a gajillion points or Auburn wins by some baloney and wins by 2, although they are one of the few SEC teams that has been able to beat Alabama more than once under the Nick Saban era. So, on paper, we should expect a relatively chalk weekend, which should give additional clarity to what the college football playoffs look like. But we haven't had a whole lot of chalk this season, and a lot of we don't really play games on paper, despite what you might hear from maybe some members of the college football playoff selection committee. They do happen on the field, and what happens on the field should reflect what we see in those final standings. We will have some more next week about what happens here at the end of the regular season and what that portends for the rest of the college football playoff and the postseason next week here on the Athletic Director U podcast. I am your host, Matt Brown. You can find my work on the Going for Two podcast with Brian Fisher and at extrapointsmb.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. We will catch up with you next week.